Nexus in the Middle East, in the South. We have today 4 researchers. All of them are graduates from London School of Economics, and they jointly worked on this study. They will talk for about 25 minutes, presenting this study methodology, findings, and some recommendations. So we have Kali, Sarah, Noor, and Isabella. So all of them are female researchers. This is why we had today with us Mazen, just to ask them a few questions related to this study after they present this research. Following that, we will have a question and answer. So feel free to prepare your questions, comments. We will have enough space for you to share your ideas, experience, information as well. From the point of view of those who are in the South, different countries, different regions and continents, it's very important for us to listen to those people to see to what extent localization is there, any progress towards localization, given that it's a trend these days, and how this enhancing accountability towards affected population. In addition to triple nexus, is it considered in all interventions in the region? Before we give the floor to the speakers, this is brief information about Trust Consultancy, where from time to time we have webinars, sessions related to the humanitarian sector, development sector, to different regions, Middle East, Syria, but beyond that, as we will see today. The floor yours to Sarah, Kali, Noor, and Isabella.
Hello, everyone. I'm Noor. I will be starting. Thank you very much, Yusuf, for the lovely introduction. So today we're talking about our latest report that, as explained, we wrote while being at the LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science. The paper is called Global Insights Unveiled, Exploring AAP Localization and the Triple Nexus from Southern Perspectives. So we're going to go through the introduction of the project and the methods, the findings, and the regional insights, the general recommendations, the conclusion, and then we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A. So introducing the project. So for decades, the humanitarian sector has faced significant challenges in upholding fundamental principles and methods. So concepts like accountability to affected populations, localization, and the Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus have emerged as promising strategies to enhance responses to crisis and promote better development outcomes, as we all know. Our project, therefore, had a clear objective to delve into these strategies exclusively from the perspective of local actors and the communities they serve in the Global South. So we have our research questions. The research questions were, in what ways do institutions in the Global South contribute to and broaden dominant policies discourses related to accountability to affected populations and localization? And to what extent, if any, do these institutions actively shape and inform policies related to AAP localization and the HDP nexus? As such, what impact do they perceive themselves as having? So rather than just evaluating the effectiveness of the local organizations, our goal was to understand whether these strategies with their interconnected goals are elevating the voices of local actors in the international humanitarian sphere. Well, as we, again, all know, there is a growing consensus on the importance of involving the Global South in shaping humanitarian responses. Putting this into action has not been an easy task. Our report pinpoints several obstacles, including power imbalances, a lack of accountability from the ground up, and the rigid funding structures. Overcoming these challenges requires a holistic approach and a commitment to tailor solutions to each and unique context. In essence, by recognizing the value of local insights and fostering genuine partnerships, we can pave the way for transformative change in crisis response. It's not just about ticking boxes, as we all know, it's about building a system that truly serves those in need, wherever they may be. Moving on to our methodology, we have employed a social constructivist approach to delve into how narratives surrounding institutions in the global south have shaped the humanitarian system, particularly in relation to AAP localization and the HDP nexus. The qualitative literature we've incorporated includes policy reviews and academic works from sources such as JSTOR and ProQuest, as well as from organizations like Relief Web, UNAP, and the Humanitarian Policy Group. Moving on to our interviews, we have conducted 14 structured interviews. We've got a list of questions there in case anyone would like to have a look. With the representative from various humanitarian development agencies and NGOs across Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. We selected these interviewees based on their involvement in implementing localization and AAP in the respective regions. And each interview covered 8 questions aligned with our research objectives and with our primary findings from the literature. The interviews were very helpful throughout this research. However, it's important to note that due to our limited geographical scope, our research might not fully capture the diversity of opinion and perspective experiences of all population and stakeholders involved in localization, AAP, or the HDP nexus in the regions that were under analysis. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Sarah. So in terms of the findings, we found the key barriers to localization, accountability to affected populations, and the HDP nexus as being captured by these 3 points. So power imbalances, funding issues, and capacity strengthening. Obviously not limited to these, but these are the ones that emerged as the most prominent throughout our interviews and throughout our literature review. Next slide, please. So starting with power imbalances, despite significant strides made on multiple fronts within the development and humanitarian agendas, power imbalances continue to hinder the effective implementation of these 3 agendas. So within the literature, there is an acknowledged resistance within the humanitarian system against the wave of localization in terms of the structure of many local and international partnerships as akin to subcontracting arrangements with the beneficiary and recipient kind of titles. And as well, aid organizations prioritize relief efforts based on their comparative advantage, thus limiting local capacity and ownership of these organizations. We found that power imbalances in general can manifest themselves in different ways. Firstly, through language barriers, then through the lack of accountability, and then thirdly, through funding disparities. And we'll talk further about these throughout the presentation. But to begin with, in terms of language barriers, in Latin America, the interviewees that we spoke to, language barriers were emphasized as a major obstacle to the advancement of the localization agenda, maintaining significant knowledge gaps between local actors and INGOs or larger donors. So we interviewed, a variety of practitioners. Some of the ones that we interviewed from Mexico highlighted that in their experience, key policy documents between INGOs and their local organizations on these agendas or on the grand bargain and agreements such as this were not being translated from English to accommodate local populations who, in that case, only spoke Spanish. And they also highlighted similarities in these difficulties with language barriers in terms of meetings with officials from these larger NGOs, in that the meetings were often conducted in English and a lot of local participants could not participate in these because of the language barriers. Moving on to the lack of accountability. The lack of bottom-up accountability significantly is lacking across all regions, and particularly in Africa. This was highlighted by the executive director of the Nigerian network of NGOs, that policies related to AAP specifically do not necessarily fall short, but it is difficult to monitor the use of feedback systems by these larger INGOs because of the fact that accountability is very absent from the bottom up still. And finally, in terms of funding disparities, the limited direct access of Southern institutions' funding impedes their decision-making abilities. So in the Middle East, practitioners emphasize that an over-reliance on external funding means that local organizations are limited and lack flexibility in how to allocate their received funds, in that donors and larger INGOs as such can exert undue power on them and constrain the way that they distribute aid amongst their communities. Kelly will be discussing this further in the next slide.
Thank you, Sarah. So building off of what Sarah mentioned with funding, the lack of access to direct, long-term, and flexible funding seemed to be a major theme across all the regions we interviewed. The Grand Bargain set a commitment for 25% of funding to go directly to local actors, but that number has seen little improvement in the years since 2016. Many figures estimate that this still sits between 1% and 4% of all funding that's going directly to these local organizations. So as the literature points out, this creates a reliance on northern intermediaries for access to funding, which takes power away from local actors as they're unable to advocate directly with donors. So one practitioner we interviewed from Latin America expressed that this reliance on northern intermediaries for funding meant that their local organizations could not make demands for what they need out of fear that donors will cut off their funding, as local actors need their northern counterparts more than these northern intermediaries need the local actors in many contexts. So this creates a situation where a practitioner that we interviewed from Syria describes where local organizations are forced to accept what donors and INGOs want to give them, even if this does not align with what their organizations and their communities actually need. So actors across all regions expressed concerns over the rigidity of the funding that they received. And the main issue arising from this is that local organizations are unable to use the funding to cover their overhead operational costs. And this leads to issues such as the inability to maintain staff, the inability to build organizational capacity, and the inability to continue working in their communities once the external funding sources run dry. So a practitioner from Africa mentioned that there were some circumstances where he and other executives of local NGOs had to cover overhead costs out of their own pockets, which greatly hindered their ability to be able to work long-term within their community. So Isabella will be going more into detail about how this hinders local capacities, but these funding issues ultimately hinder effective localization and AAP efforts by starving local actors and communities of the resources they need to establish themselves and to continue operating long-term within their communities, which is necessary for local actors to build trust and relationships within the communities they serve. And this trust and long-term presence is crucial for successful AAP. Over to you, Isabella.
Thank you. So localization and capacity strengthening are intrinsically linked. To achieve localization and equal partnership between large international organizations and regional or local organizations, local actors must have the capacity to respond to humanitarian crises and to address their own development needs as they arise. The literature reveals that the key challenge in improving the capacity of local actors are the lack of policy direction necessary to implement localization, as well as an overall perceived lack of local capacity, which results in unintentional marginalization of local actors. Because localization will require unique approaches in each individual context, there's an overarching need to dedicate more time and resources to improve capacity. Recent examples of capacity strengthening in the literature include less reliance on international humanitarian actors in both Latin America and Asia, the case of the Indonesian government's decision to prohibit intervention by international aid agencies following the 2018 earthquake is a noteworthy example. Throughout the interview process, the need for capacity strengthening was underscored by interviewees in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. In the Middle East, practitioners emphasized that the risk of operating in protracted crises, such as in Syria and the subsequent refugee crisis, there's a need to increase local capacity, as these local actors are often more aware of local cultural norms and best situated to access remote areas and conflict zones. In Asia, interviewees mentioned the importance of organizations such as ICFA, the NEAR Network, the Alliance for Empowering Partnerships, and START Network, which are used to advance equitable partnerships. The organization Humanitarian Aid International has created the Local Organizations Coalition for Advancing Localization, a collaborative platform for frontline and grassroots organizations in India to discuss challenges and funding opportunities. Across all regions, local partnership was emphasized as an approach to ensure compliance to professional standards and to improve program outcomes. Practitioners working in Africa emphasized that the lack of local capacity was an ongoing challenge, which often manifests in the exclusion of local knowledge and the lack of feedback mechanisms offered to local populations, which may improve program outcomes. There was also an overarching emphasis on the desire to move away from a subcontractor relationship towards shared capacity between larger INGOs and local NGOs. And now on to our conclusion. The regional disparities,
Thank you, Isabella. So since our research focused on a regional approach across the 4 regions of Africa, Asia, Middle East, Latin America, we found a lot of divergences as expected across these 4 regions and thought it would be interesting to highlight a few of these. So firstly, in Asia, we found that this region stood out as the most capable and successful of adopting these 3 agendas. And in specifically, the localization agenda was most advanced in Southeast Asia, whereas the fulfillment of AAP programs and the successful practical application of these continued to remain challenging, as highlighted by the practitioners that we interviewed. Following this, in Latin America, on the other hand, localization has seen very limited progress, especially in Mexico, whereas AAP has been implemented more, but where it has implemented, it has usually been carried out more as a procedure rather than something that needs to be done and something that is considered vital and effective for affected populations. As well, the establishment of local partnerships, especially in Mexico and within the Latin American region, showed that local NGOs are striving to make their own advancements in partnership and collaboration amongst themselves, which was a positive highlighted by both the Mexican practitioners that we interviewed. Thirdly, in the Middle East, funding was raised as the main barrier to the localization agenda due to a lack of institutional sustainability. And as long as this continues, no meaningful localization can happen across national organizations, so long that they are reliant on external funding from large donors and INGOs. And finally, in Africa, international commitments to localizing humanitarian action are not manifesting at the scale or speed necessary in these regions, and reluctance exists in fully embracing and committing to the AAP agenda, especially amongst local NGOs who have not seen much progress in these so far. So moving on to the next part on intra-regional disparities, we similarly found disparities within regions, which was quite interesting, and this was done through the fact that we interviewed, for example, in Africa, practitioners from different countries. So one of the practitioners that we interviewed was in Nigeria and the other one was in Somalia. And the biggest difference across these 2 countries that was highlighted by both of them was the capacity itself of local actors to implement such agendas. So one practitioner in Nigeria observed capacity amongst the local NGOs as very weak, meaning that they lack the resources necessary for successful localization, whereas by contrast, the Somali practitioner highlighted that NGOs in Somalia have the necessary capacity to be able to affect their needs and address those of affected populations, but progress still remains challenging. On the other hand, in Latin America, when we spoke to both practitioners, they emphasized that Mexico itself as a country in the region lags behind the rest of the countries in terms of the localization and AAP agendas, citing Venezuela and Colombia as countries with more developed, robust structures for humanitarian knowledge sharing. Now on to the conclusions.
Thank you, Sarah. So throughout our report, we found that the links between AAP localization and the HDP nexus are often unclear to practitioners within the Global South, although AAP and localization seem to be more closely related than the HDP nexus. Many practitioners express that engaging with the peace nexus can be politically risky, and there is confusion regarding the separation of humanitarian and development work. Next, the overarching similarities across regions include the need to improve the current funding system so that organizations are able to function more sustainably and cover their own overhead costs, which will also improve their capacity and further their localization efforts. The challenge of addressing power imbalances may prove to be one of the most difficult ones to overcome, as it will require transformative systematic change that is necessary to create equal partnerships between large international organizations and region and local actors. Moreover, many challenges faced by local organizations and practitioners in the Global South are unique to specific contexts and cannot be captured within this report. But through our interviews process, we were able to gain insight into the experiences of practitioners working on issues related to the agendas of localization, AAP, and the HDP nexus throughout the Global South. So before we conclude, we would like to thank and express our gratitude for every interviewee that decided to speak with us and further our understanding on these three agendas, while we kind of attempted to create a report that offers interesting insights into the progress of these agendas across the Global South and bringing out the voices of local actors within it. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. We've got time for questions.
Thank you very much, Kelly, Sarah, Noor, and Isabella for this interesting presentation where you talked about, I mean, there are many of these findings maybe well known for us working in the humanitarian sector localization. Some of them might be strange. We are going to ask Mazen Al-Husseini, who is a Syrian humanitarian. He worked in Syria for a long period of time, and also he has experience in other contexts as well, many countries in Asia, for instance, and Africa as well, to share with us some comments, some questions about this study and research. After that, we will be listening to our audience. In case you have any question, feel free to type in the chat box or just unmute yourself. Mazen, please.
Yes, thanks so much, Yusuf. Thanks so much, ladies. I will start directly with a few questions so that it could be appetizers for the participants here with us in order to share their thoughts, their questions. I could see in the chat box a couple of questions had already been shared. So I will start with you, Isabella, if you allow me. So this is a hot topic that you have tried to look at within a master dissertation. So congratulations, first of all, for completing this research and completing your dissertation as well. So the curiosity is that what made you select this topic for your research, and what is the role of UNICEF in all of this process that you have done? Over to you, Isabella.
Yes, thank you, Mazen. So our research question was based off of a terms of reference sheet that we received from our client at UNICEF in October last year. And this project was of interest to UNICEF's work on community engagement and accountability, as well as the Interagency Standing Committee's Task Force on Localization. So we worked as student consultants from November of 2023 until March of this year, conducting a literature review on AAP localization and the HDP Nexus, and carrying out interviews with practitioners, including Mazen and Youssef, throughout the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And we had bi-weekly meetings with our clients at UNICEF over this time period to receive their input and feedback on the direction of our project. And in March, our team delivered our final report and presentation. And in June, a shortened version of our report was published on the Interagency Standing Committee's Accountability and Inclusion portal of the United Nations. So for us, that was a nice indication that the information that we delivered to the clients was received and that they appreciated the time that we took to conduct these interviews and create an analysis to show the shortcomings in the field and how the UN is, although they're striving to implement these agendas, they're often falling behind. And this was the perspective of our interviewees and the literature review, that these were the areas where they most need improvement.
Wow, what a long process you guys have went through from last year till now, in addition to studying as well. Thanks so much, Isabella, for that. I will move on to Noor. So Noor, if you allow me, in your opinion, what are the drivers that lead to the development of policies and approaches such as the AAP, the localization, and the triple nexus?
Thank you for your question, Mazen, and all the praises. I think a central driver is the recognition of entrenched power imbalances between the global north and the global south. So approaches like AAP localization and the triple HDP nexus seek to shift the power dynamics by elevating the role of local actors, of course, and their communities in the humanitarian development processes, trying to move away, from a top-down, global north-dominated model of doing humanitarian work. Of course, there is a growing understanding that local actors as well have a better knowledge of their own context, which, having a better knowledge of their own context, of course, leads to more effective and sustainable solutions and change and long-term change. So stuff like localization, the triple nexus, aim to leverage this lack of local knowledge and to improve the relevance and impact of these interventions. I think AAP and localization are driven by the demand as well of greater accountability to the people and communities that humanitarian and development efforts are meant to serve, and they're not currently serving right now. This is part, obviously, of a broader movement towards inclusive, transparent, and participatory approaches that prioritize the voices of all the affected populations. I think in particular, the triple nexus approach arises from the need to bridge the gap between humanitarian aid, development, and peace-building efforts. I think this integration is essential in addressing the root causes of conflict and crisis, thereby fostering more sustainable and long-term development outcomes. So I think in particular, the triple nexus is needed to understand how we can't keep doing aid forever, but instead the peace efforts would lead to greater development efforts and long-term solutions. Thank you.
Cool. Since we are talking about participation, so it is a good time to give the floor to our colleagues here with us. So I could see in the chat box, there is a number of questions right now. There is one directed to Sarah that I could start with until figuring out the other questions. So for Sarah, one of the questions is that one of the findings is lack of the accountability. So could you tell us more, in which country do you have, or you have faced such thing?
Yes, for sure. I think the lack of accountability, especially bottom up, was a common theme. And it was one of the main conclusions from our research, both within the literature and also on the ground from local practitioners. The fact that there is accountability top down, but not bottom up, which obviously undermines the effectiveness of collective efforts in terms of advancing these agendas. So, as such, it's almost like a double standard that's being created, right? In the sense that top-down accountability is expected, but when bottom-up accountability is requested from these local organizations, it's not reciprocated from larger INGOs. So both in the Latin American region actually and in Africa, practitioners highlighted a significant challenge in achieving the localization agenda because of these lack of accountability. So for example, I remember one of the practitioners in Mexico who is from an organization called FM4 Paso Libre. If anyone knows the organization, just thought I'd highlight, mentioned something along the lines that he cannot ask international agencies for accountability because he does not have the power to. He is not in the same negotiating scene as them, in that the local organizations need these larger NGOs more than they need them, right? So as such, they viewed the AAP process more as a procedure rather than something that the INGOs genuinely deemed important, sorry. So it was almost something that they had to tick rather than something they genuinely cared about or something that they actually wanted to advance and better in. And then similarly in Africa, one of the practitioners from Nigeria highlighted a gap between policy formulation and the practical implementation of AAP. So while the policies do exist and they don't fall short, it is difficult to monitor the effective feedback mechanisms used by INGOs. And so as a result of this, the accountability remains largely absent from the bottom up, thus emphasizing the need for increasing transparency in how feedback is being used by these larger NGOs, especially after they've collected the data and done their surveys. And as well, like in terms of long term, seeing what policy changes this has influenced and how we can continue to close this critical gap between the two.
Cool, interesting. I could see a couple of questions related to capacity strengthening, but I will pose these further later. So I will move on with a question related to the ICR, because I also have a question related to the funding. So Kelly, if you allow me, I will start with my question, and then I will move to the question from Yunus Hassan on the ICR. So my question is that, so OCHA reported a global aid funding gap, which is about 33.4 billion for 2023. And one of the recommendations in your report was the importance of multi-year funding to reduce local NGOs' financial vulnerability. So how can we ensure that these 33.4 billion was provided and multi-year funding was offered, that the local and national organizations would be able to use some of it to cover their overhead costs? So it's similar to the question from Yunus about the ICR and the limitation of offering that ICR to the local organizations. Over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Mazen. So in regards to funding, I believe that we should encourage donors to provide unrestricted and flexible funding options. I think a really good option for this is long-term locally managed pool funds that give local and national NGOs the autonomy to decide how they want to use these funds, and also just trusting these organizations to know how these funds are best used for them. So this will require improving trust between local and national NGOs and donors through transparent reporting. So local NGOs should work closely to monitor and accurately document their overhead costs to improve donor confidence in where these funds are going and how they're contributing to the success of programs in these organizations. On the other side, more efforts need to be made on parts of donors and INGOs to recognize the importance and the impact of these overhead costs and to treat them as they're equally important to the overhead costs of INGOs. Additionally, to improve trust in the ability of managing overhead costs, donors and INGOs should invest in building the capacity of local and national NGOs who lack the capacity to effectively manage and document their finances. I know that the IASC has the provision of overheads to local and national partners that provides several recommendations on this. And part of that is it calls on INGOs to require the inclusion of overhead costs in their program budget. But there's limited documentation on how this has been implemented so far.
Cool, fantastic. Thanks so much, Kelly, for that. As you have highlighted, the capacity and the trust are one of the, or two of the main factors. So I will move my question to Sarah to talk about the capacity strengthening, since she have finished the slides presentation with the capacity strengthening. So Sarah, in the chat box, as you can see, there is a number of things related to, or questions related to the capacity strengthening, capacity sharing. I will pick one of it from Karam Hilli. So Karam particularly said, what should be considered by INGO to shift power to local people and their community for sure, rather than just forwarding the funding? So how can they recognize the capacity of local community and use the capacity sharing instead of capacity building and capacity strengthening? So we haven't touched on capacity sharing in your report, but we have touched on capacity strengthening. Some still criticize the term, the usage of the term capacity strengthening, even though no one is still using the capacity building term. But how we could ensure that the capacity strengthening or capacity sharing is done to transfer the power or shift the power to the local communities. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you for the questions. I think touching on what Will as well mentioned in the chat, it's important to distinguish between the capacities that we're talking about, right? So in terms of our report and what we found, we observed a lack of capacities amongst local organizations. So by that, we mean the fact that they don't have the necessary resources to be able to, whether it's funding with covering their overhead costs, or even to kind of enter the space, in that they don't have enough funding, they don't have enough capacity to implement donor projects or to even sign up to them. And so a big thing with this was touching on the power imbalances, right? So in order to move towards a capacity sharing agenda, the system needs to fundamentally change, in that there needs to be a shift in mentality and in mindset, in that we can share power, right? And that it's not only the donors and it's not only the INGOs. And I think until this happens, we won't be seeing necessary capacity sharing or strengthening, because the local actors by these organizations oftentimes are not seen as capable, right? And so that's the biggest thing. But as I mentioned, funding is a big one in terms of the lack of capacity. Like as we saw in Syria with a lot of NGOs, they can't even cover their own overhead costs. And even in Africa, a few practitioners mentioning having to use their own salaries and their own money to cover the organization's overhead costs. And, by improving the funding mechanisms, in that detaching the conditionalities and actually allocating more of the annual budgets to local organizations. And I think we saw some figure like 0.07% of annual funding is allocated to local organizations. And this needs to all change and improve before we can actually truly commit to capacity sharing and strengthening.
Indeed, I do share with you the shocking figures that we have received yesterday from the HLA's presentation. One of the colleagues, I remember he was maybe the regional director of NRC in Europe. He said that 0.07% of the funds, which were millions for Ukraine, were channeled to local organizations. So it's not only about fund, it's about the quality of funding as well that we are talking about over here. So if you allow me to move on to Isabella. So Isabella, Sarah have talked about the capacity sharing, the importance of capacity sharing, the importance of also the quality of funding. But still, there is always that debate. What capacity do we need to strengthen? We already have the capacity as a local organization. So what are you talking over here when you are talking about capacity strengthening? So this is one. And the second thing, if you allow us, about the compliance and risk mitigation standards as well. So there's always that rumors that the local organizations lack such things related to the compliance and risk mitigation standards. So have you touched on those during your report, Isabella?
Yeah, this is definitely was a theme throughout a lot of our interviews, that the compliance and risk mitigation strategies were something that some local organizations struggled with, either due to lack of awareness about these new international standards and compliance measures. And as I mentioned, one of the practitioners in India has created their own collaborative platform to share knowledge between local organizations operating within a specific region in order to improve their response and to help each other with grant applications and reporting mechanisms and things that otherwise might be unfamiliar to organizations that aren't as accessible or reached by large international INGOs. So I think there's a need to make sure that these are accessible in the languages that the organizations, either through translation services or through providing the resources in the appropriate language, so that the information is available. And I think that's the most important step to improving compliance and to recognizing the areas of shortcomings within risk and all of that.
Cool. Thanks so much, Isabella, on touching on those important things. I will move on to a question from Josiane, if I spelled the name correctly. So if I could address this question to Noor. So Noor, our colleague here, Josiane, is asking what's next? So how you are going to take this report, this research forward in terms of actionable steps by donors, by INGOs, by UN agencies, and for sure by local communities and their organizations. So any thoughts, Noor?
Thank you for the great question. I think thinking about the future, the important thing should be the effort put into these agendas. The agendas are out there, but I think as our report points out, there is a lack of communication between international donors, between international organizations and local organizations. I think building on what Sarah was talking about earlier, I think importantly, the system needs to change. There should be more trust, more funds put onto the local organizations, because local organizations do know most of the time what is best for the affected populations around them. There is more communication around the issues, and there is more of a day-to-day life practice compared to international organizations and their involvement within these issues. So I think, to cut long answer short, I think it's a matter of wanting to actually bring to life these agendas and make them count and let them achieve what they were born to achieve. And I think that needs to start from the top.
Have colleagues from UNICEF told you what they are going to do with this report, Noor?
Well, they have told us that they are sharing it with their task forces, and they were really happy about the results. They were really happy about the findings. Of course, there were a couple of points that we could have built it on, but we had so much time and so many resources, of course. Yeah. But I think even with UNICEF, it's an interesting dynamic, because we're talking about local empowerment. We're talking about the importance of giving local organizations a space and the attention needed. And of course, UNICEF is a big organization, and it's one of the big founders. So I think we wait and see and hope for the best.
No worries, Noor. Sarah, have something to add on this question as well. Sarah?
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to jump in. We actually met with the clients in Geneva. This was a very productive conversation. We shared our insights, and as a result, I think, of the report and everything, we actually had our research published on the Interagency Standing Committee portal. So we're happy to share that link as well with anyone who is interested in looking at that. So it is published. It is a shorter version of a report because the original one was around 40 pages. So we condensed the finding in a shorter report, and that has been published and is accessible to everyone. Yes, thank you, Teresa, for sharing. Teresa is actually one of the clients from UNICEF, so it's great to see you here supporting us as well. But yes, definitely. I think as Noor said, continuing to share with their network, and as well the fact that it was published is a huge achievement for us, for sure.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah, for that. Since you already have you with us, so I will read Muhammad's Muaqqat's question, and then you have a comment on that. So maybe I will give you the floor to tell us what your answer was. So Muhammad's saying there is an ongoing initiative here in the UK talking about Funder Plus, which is basically exploring ways funders can be more accountable to their funded partners with regards to co-funding, multi-year funding, proportional reporting, reduction of unused data, reporting for learning, not for the sake of reporting. That's good. And then you have answered that. So do you want to jump in here and tell us what have you found during your report?
Yes, sure. So in terms of the funding, not many local organizations were talking about particular initiatives advanced, because as we mentioned, there is still a lack of this and there is still greater need for that. However, like from our literature review, from previous webinars that we've attended, we have been, even as Mohammed said, there have been initiatives that have come out, obviously, to try and address these funding issues. So I mentioned here the Save the Children International Flexible Funding Approach. I actually first heard of this the other day when I was attending a webinar, which I thought was quite interesting. I had never heard of it before, and it was introduced by Save the Children Sweden in 2021 to try and change the funding dynamics from a delivery model to more of a relationship model. So essentially looking at civil society organizations as partners to act within their own rights, and to provide them with support in terms of them being able to make their own decisions when it comes to funding, without conditionalities, and allowing them, as mentioned in the chat somewhere, to let them pool their funds. So the importance of locally led pool funds as well, definitely something that came up a lot and something that a lot of local practitioners agreed on. So definitely increasing transparency, leadership, will lead to a greater transformation overall, but we are yet to see the effectiveness of these agendas and of these initiatives. But for sure, it's good that there's steps being made in the right direction. Hopefully they will continue, and we just have to see.
Cool. I just wanted to ask our colleague from Save the Children, I think Will von Schrader, if he or she wants to unmute themselves and talk more about it, about Save the Children unrestricted pool fund, locally led pool fund, if they are happy to do that. Else, I could read the comment.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Hi, everybody. Will von Schrader. I'm the Senior Director for Localization at Save US. So I think we're talking about two different models. The first is the locally led pooled funding model that we've been supporting in various countries. And it generally operates like any other pooled funding model. We collect resources from multiple donors, put them in a pool, and then in a pooled fund, and then those are reallocated to fund various humanitarian initiatives. I think what's different about these models is sort of the governance structures that are established around them, where decision-making, day-to-day management, strategic guidance is strictly in the hands of the local actors that are members of those funds themselves. As the INGO partner in this model, we serve a role strictly limited to fundraising and offering technical and operational support to these actors when and where needed, as well as to help strengthen the institutional sustainability of the fund itself. When it comes to AAP, we found this to be really impactful because it's not an international actor deciding where these funds go and which responses are prioritized. It's members of the communities themselves within those local organizations that are making those decisions. And we think this is really positive. And as I mentioned in the chat, while we're very involved in them now, we have defined exit plans in place to the point where in the next year or two, in some of these models, Save the Children will be phasing ourselves out entirely for these models to stand alone as legally registered and sustainable, locally led funding mechanisms, and really encourage that to be taken up elsewhere. And then the other model that was referenced from our colleagues in Sweden is something that we call the core support model. And it's really a different approach we're taking to partnerships. We refer to it more as a partnership model, where we work with these organizations, support them to develop long-term strategic plans, extend capacity strengthening, but also a key part of that is the extension of unearmarked core funding to these organizations that they can use at their discretion to advance their own strategic priorities, to cover core costs, invest in capacities, plug gaps on programming and advocacy initiatives that resonate with their communities. That's a relatively new model. We piloted it out over the last few years and have integrated it more at scale in some of our programs. And I think there will actually be some evaluations and reporting coming out on that towards the end of this year and early next year. So we'll be very happy to have that available for others to learn more from it when it's out there.
Thanks so much, Will. And sorry for putting you at the spot. Will, is that funded from institutional donors or non-traditional donors? Just for the curiosity of the participants here, they just wanted to know, is institutional donors really working based upon their commitment, or no, it's non-traditional donors, foundations, etc., that are funding such amazing programs that we are talking about over here?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So for the core support model, this was initiative from our colleagues in Sweden. It was primarily funded through SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency. We often thought that maybe this was a model that wouldn't resonate with some of our other international donors, USAID, et cetera. But we're seeing sort of a sea shift and seeing donors like USAID increasingly becoming open to these concepts and to the idea of extending unearmarked core funding as a complement to capacity strengthening, which we see as a very positive development. There's obviously a lot farther that these donors need to go, but it's a good sign. And for the locally led pooled funds, it's really a blend. We have institutional donors contributing to them. We have private foundational donors contributing to them. And we're even seeing a growth in sort of like large individual philanthropic donors being interested in these models as well. So there's really a diverse range of funding that can be brought into these approaches. And we feel that like proof of concept is coming into shape where hopefully that can really influence more to get behind models like these that really put the local actors themselves at the heart of deciding where and how humanitarian resources are allocated.
Cool. Thanks so much for that, Will. Back to Sarah, if you allow me, Sarah. Sorry, this is the last question for you, I promise. The question is about the accountability. So as you can see here from the chat box, there is always that debate. Shall local communities fight for their rights in order to hold donors, INGOs, and as well as national and local organizations accountable and gain the power by themselves? Or it is something that is a privilege, should be given from the upstream down to the bottom, which is to the community? And precisely the role of national and international organizations, is it just to be accountable in front of those institutional donors and non-traditional donors, or how they could be accountable, hold themselves accountable to the local communities as well? So that's the debate that we always have. Is it something that we should fight for, or it is a privilege that we could take because of the generosity of those that have the power, such as the donors? Sarah?
Yes, sorry. No, I definitely don't think it's something that should be fought for. I think it's something that should be inherent in all practices, right? And I think as well, you mentioned, should these local NGOs only be accountable to higher up donors? No, definitely not. They are accountable to their communities, to the local populations that they serve, to the crises and the conflicts that they are helping to mitigate. And so definitely accountability is shared everywhere, right? It's not only bottom up or top down. It's amongst the whole cohort, the whole, whether it's NGOs, local organizations, populations, it's a government as well. So it's all about a collaboration amongst all these entities to ensure that. But another thing that we found as well was the lack of performance measurement frameworks to be able to measure localization, to be able to measure these accountabilities. I think once these start to kick in more, and once there are increases in performance measurement frameworks, there will be more recognition on different parts of whether that's, I don't know, governments, whether that's multilaterals, whether that's donors and larger NGOs, on actually the advancements of these agendas and the benefits that they bring. And so what Will mentioned about the funding program and the fact that they'll release like a report or something that's accessible for everyone to show the progress is great. And I think that's what everyone's striving for, right? To actually show that this is working, right? Because it's hard when it's just the local actors advocating for this, right? And we've seen the skepticism that still exists between the system to combat this. And so also creating performance measurement frameworks, I think there are quite a few amongst local organizations. When we spoke to some of the Spanish practitioners, they were actually talking about their own AAP implementation systems that they implemented. So we were conversing with one of the migrant refugee organizations, and they actually carry out their own AAP programs because they couldn't rely on the donor and on the INGO to do so. So they took kind of matters into their own hands, and they collected their own results from that and are working based on those results, right? So they're also trying to constantly improve. And so I think it's definitely about that, for sure.
Cool. Thanks so much, Sarah. Last question as well for Isabella. Isabella, as you could see here, one of the comments that we have started with from Muhammad, he said, little localization because of little funding, because of little sustainability, because of little funding. So there is a chain over here. So how we could break the chain? In other words, I will translate that in my words, is that international actors may argue that the training courses they are offering on good reporting, on proposal writing, are under the capacity strengthening commitment. Do you think that such activities help local and national organizations to maintain their sustainability?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I definitely think that these workshops are a part of what needs to be a larger response and a recognition of the power imbalances that we've mentioned throughout the presentation, and that kind of characterize the whole system, and that prevent local actors from having all of the resources that they need to be truly sustainable. And while these training workshops are great if they're able to reach all of the organizations that need them, as we found that that's often not the case. And so the effort is there, but it definitely could be improved and much more comprehensive in order to break this chain. And I think that the recognition of this pattern of lack of funding, lack of capacity, and the whole cycle that you mentioned, it's a step in the right direction, but there needs to be probably fundamental change of the systems in order to truly address these issues, in order to truly localize and be accountable to affected populations. There needs to be a much broader change. So yes, these workshops are a step in the right direction, but there's definitely more that needs to be done to account for all of the discrepancies between large, powerful organizations and their local counterparts.
At least we are on the right track. That's what we could say.
Hopefully.
Yes, hopefully as well. Yes. Noor, I had a question for you, but because of the lack of time, I think there is a research need to be done on that question, which is about the colonization and the link of transformational change. So I will keep that question to myself, Noor, because of the time. I just wanted to thank the 4 colleagues here with us for sharing the results of their report. I wanted to share their university, the UNICEF as well, that stands behind them in order to have such a report. And good luck with your dissertation, ladies, once again. And back to Yusuf.
Thank you very much, Mazen, and our speakers as well for this very interesting session. And again, always we will have debates. We need to have many research about localization, because so far, what has been done so far, I mean, so much in terms of research studies, workshops, etc. But when we go to the ground, as I am as a local person in Syria or in Turkey, for instance, I don't see. When I hear, I mean, these studies, reports, and donors, etc., I am very happy. But when I go to the field, I find something different. So where to focus more? Shall we focus more on capacity or access to direct funding or power transfer, etc.? There is a question. Maybe this differs from one context to another. And also, who is responsible for localization? If you would like to progress localization, efforts from local NGOs, local actors should be there, or from donors, or from international partners, etc. My point of view always is from those who have power should come. We should progress localization. Those who are in the field or local actors, etc. Maybe they need to work on access. Do they work to capacity, not on funding? Because if you have capacity, you can have access to direct funding, etc. Always, there are many things to do as well, but this is a very interesting conversation. We see that points of view of different actors here also. We have Save the Children, we have, for instance, some local NGOs in Syria or another country in Africa. They are talking about these things. And yeah, thank you very much for this, and looking forward to seeing you in other webinars in the future related to the humanitarian sector or localization, or even monitoring and evaluation, where we see if there is a good level of localization or not from the assignment we have in trust consultancy. I see from third-party monitoring, even local actors, they are isolated from third-party monitoring reports, where this is to serve localization, to serve local actors, but they are not involved even in this very small exercise. Here, no funding, here, no capacity here, but just they need to know.
Oops, I think we have lost Yusuf. Sarah, do you want to add anything before?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yusuf. Sarah wanted to have something. Sarah, over to you.
I just wanted to say a massive thank you for everyone who participated, and to Trust Consultancy for giving us this opportunity to present our findings and share our results with everyone. So thank you very much. And I hope it was useful and it was interesting for everyone.
Yes, thank you for organizing it. Thank you for giving us the time and space, as you mentioned, to share our results. And thank you.
Thanks, colleagues, for joining us in this webinar. As mentioned, we will share the recording. We will share the event by IASC as well as the report. Until that time, take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.